In the middle of the Sahara, where the air shimmers with the heat, dozens of crates are opened. Out of them burst bees, thousands, millions, right above the sand, in temperatures close to 122 degrees Fahrenheit. People in white protective suits step back and the swarm disappears. At first glance, it's madness, releasing bees in the hottest desert on the planet. But in 2023, the UN and several African governments actually decided to test whether it's possible to bring life back to the Sahara with the help of insects. For this experiment, bee queens were caught somewhere in Europe over 2 weeks, kept in refrigerators to slow down their metabolism, and then transported across the sea and through the sands to the heart of the desert. All for one goal: to make the lifeless land green again, to give plants a chance to restore the soil and maybe one day turn these dunes into meadows and fields. But the Sahara doesn't welcome outsiders, and from the first moment it was obvious this experiment might not go the way they hoped. Sandy Stain. An unobtrusive reminder to do that thing under the video. What happens when bees appear somewhere? Everything changes. Not gradually, literally from the first days. Bees are the engine of the planet. Without them, half of the food we're used to simply wouldn't exist. Almost a third of all crops in the US depend on honeybees, from apples and almonds to melons, lettuce, and broccoli. They connect plants into a single living system. When bees disappear, the chain falls apart, and there's no way to replace it. Without pollination, plants can't reproduce. Without plants, herbivores vanish. Without herbivores, predators go away. Step by step, nature crumbles. In Europe, about 80% of all crops and wildflowers depend on bees. Take them away, and almost 9 out of 10 species will simply be gone. But this balance works both ways. When bees return to places where they'd been gone, everything comes back to life. Flowers bloom again, seeds spread farther, new forms of life gather around them. That's exactly what the experiment in the Sahara was meant for. To make life's chain reaction begin again where there's only been sand for thousands of years. To make the desert itself disappear. It's hard to think of the desert as an enemy until you look at a map. The Sahara isn't just sand, it's a giant that's already swallowed half a continent. The largest hot desert on Earth keeps growing, claiming new land from people every year. Its body stretches from the Atlantic to the Red Sea across 11 countries: Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and farther down into Africa. In Algeria, it covers 80% of the land. In Libya, almost 95%. Even in Egypt, 2/3 of the country are already under sand. Satellite images show it clearly. The Sahara isn't standing still, it's moving. But people still keep trying to fight back. Egypt, for example, grows crops right among the dunes, green circles in the middle of nowhere, like an attempt to prove that the Sahara can be fooled. But the desert doesn't retreat. Over the past few decades, it's grown by about 10% and keeps creeping forward, swallowing pastures, towns, everything in its path. So the idea of bringing life back here looks not just desperate, it's insane. Releasing bees into a place where the air itself melts. These are insects that die at 104 degrees Fahrenheit, while in the Sahara, the sand heats up to 158 degrees Fahrenheit. But people still decided to release bees into the desert. To give you an idea how sensitive bees are, let's take another hot place, Nevada. There are over 1,000 bee species living there, but since the early 2000s, their numbers have been steadily dropping. Partly because in the southern part of the state it gets so hot that hives literally melt. And bees aren't stupid, they just fly off looking for better conditions. Speaking of melting, that's not a metaphor. A hive can actually start to move when it overheats. Bees do love warmth, but everything has its limit. The perfect temperature inside the hive is about 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and if it gets any hotter, that's game over. The larva can stop developing and die. The colony weakens, sometimes even the queen stops laying eggs until it cools down. Adult bees usually handle heat a bit better, but at extreme temperatures, everything falls apart. Literally, at 104 degrees Fahrenheit, the honeycomb starts softening and collapsing because they're made of beeswax. That wax is the foundation of the whole hive. It's used to build those hexagonal cells where they store honey, pollen, and raise their young. It gives the hive its house structure. But wax is a tricky material. It melts in heat like a candle because, well, candles are made of wax too. So if the temperature rises too high, everything the bees built for weeks or even years just melts away. There's even a real-life example. In 2022, in the Moroccan village of Inzirki, down in the southwest, spring came with silence instead of the usual buzzing. Huge bee colonies died from drought. For a village where beekeeping was the main source of income, it became an ecological and economic disaster. And Morocco, by the way, partly lies within the Sahara zone. The desert doesn't cover the whole country, of course, but it's nearby, and apparently bees there are already in serious trouble. So for now, all this doesn't sound too promising. It's like the bees don't stand much of a chance in such conditions. Surprisingly enough, bees actually know how to deal with heat. They've got their own perfectly effective cooling methods. Like I said, the ideal temperature inside a hive is around 95 degrees Fahrenheit. In winter, bees keep it warm by huddling tightly together, sealing up cracks and just buzzing. Yeah, the sounds we hear from outside actually help them generate heat. In summer, it's the other way around. To avoid overheating, worker bees fly back and forth all day long, creating airflow. And when it gets really hot outside, the foragers bring back not only nectar and pollen, but also water. It evaporates and cools the inside of the hive. Some bees even fan their wings like tiny ventilators to keep the air moving. That's why beekeepers usually don't worry about their colonies unless the temperature climbs above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That's already pretty hot, but most of the time the bees manage just fine, blowing the hot air out of their hives. Real problems start only when the heat lasts too long, and that's exactly what happens in the Sahara all the time. Still, there's a way out. You could release not regular bees there, but local ones, those that already know how to live in the heat. And such bees do exist. For example, the East African lowland honeybee. It's a subspecies of the common honeybee and looks almost the same, just a bit smaller. Its upper body is covered with soft fuzz and its abdomen has black stripes. Basically a bee like any other. It lives in the southern and eastern parts of Africa, already hot regions where other species would struggle. Over thousands of years, these bees have adapted to drought and heat, and at the same time have become more aggressive. Naturally, they're not angry just for the sake of it, it's about survival. In Africa, natural selection works like this. Only colonies that can defend their stores and their hives survive. They chase away predators, fight competitors for food, and as a result, pass on their genes. The calmer, less active colonies simply vanished over time. There's another interesting option, the Arabian or Nubian honeybee. It lives just south of the Sahara in Sudan, Somalia, and the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, basically right around the region where we want to run our experiment. These bees handle drought really well and can survive summer heat above 104 degrees Fahrenheit. In the same conditions, other subspecies lose entire colonies in just one season, while the Nubian honeybees keep living and working. So if there are any bees that can survive in the Sahara, it's them. Scientists even call their heat resistance one of a kind. First off, they're a bit smaller than regular honeybees. It might seem like a small thing, but that's exactly what helps them deal with heat stress. Size really matters here because a smaller body means faster heat exchange. Such bees get rid of excess heat more easily and don't overheat. And when the hive gets crowded, there's actually more space between smaller bees, so the hive doesn't turn into an oven. Young bees inside don't get baked alive. That's pretty important too. Secondly, they're lighter in color than other species. Their yellowish tone reflects some sunlight, and their short hair helps them stay cool. Basically, they've got a built-in sun protection system. On top of that, these bees live in smaller colonies, and if it gets too hot, they simply reduce their numbers to keep the hive from overheating. Smart, right? Too bad you can't do that on public transport. And that's not all. Nubian honeybees have genetic differences, special cells, and even slightly different behavior. In everyday life, they act differently, all for the sake of surviving the heat that kills other bees. In short, you can't release ordinary bees into the Sahara, the climate would just wipe them out. But with these ones, it might actually work. At least they've got a real shot. By the way, just 15 years ago, in the middle of the sun-scorched Sahara, they actually found bees, real honeybees, alive, working, just lost among the sands. In the Kufra Oasis, right in the northern part of the desert, scientists discovered bees that had been living there in isolation for about 10,000 years. Imagine that. The same colonies, generation after generation, surrounded by sand, cut off from the rest of the world. Technically, they're Apis mellifera, the same honeybee that pollinates apples, melons, nuts, and basically every third bite of food on the planet. But genetic analysis showed that the Kufra bees are noticeably different from all the others. It's like they've evolved on their own. According to researchers, these bees settled in Kufra around 5,000 to 10,000 years ago, right when the climate suddenly changed and the once green savanna turned into what we now call the desert. Today, all life in the oasis depends on underground water. Without it, nothing would survive. But before that climate shift, some 11,000 years ago, the Sahara looked completely different. There were lakes, rivers, meadows, forests. Africa was a green continent that later dried up and turned to sand. But that's a topic for another video. Today we're talking about bees, and the fact that there's still hope to bring them back. These hermit bees prove that life can hold on even in the very heart of the desert. And if they're released not into bare sand, but into places with at least a bit of vegetation, where there's nectar to collect, the bees can survive. If you think about it, bringing bees back could give African farmers not just an ecological benefit, but a very real economic one. Pollination isn't just about flowers and honey, it's a serious business. In the US, for example, scientists estimate that wild bees contribute about $3.1 billion to agriculture every year. Add in the domesticated honeybees and the total shoots up to $15 billion. As I mentioned before, without these insects, half the fruits and vegetables we eat simply wouldn't exist. Nothing can replace them, not drones, not robots. In southwest China, where bees have almost disappeared because of habitat loss, all kinds of pesticides, and overly active honey harvesting, farmers had to take brushes in their hands. Yes, regular paintbrushes to manually pollinate apple and pear blossoms, transferring pollen from one flower to another. So if Africa manages to bring bee populations back, it'll also be a pretty big economic win. And you know what? There's a place where bees in the desert don't just survive, they actually make a difference. It's Israel. Down south in the Arava Desert, life is buzzing, all thanks to honeybees. Local farmers have learned to grow bee colonies right among the sands, and the results are impressive. On the Porid farm in the Ein Yahav settlement, bees are downright thriving. I mean, all around is scorched land, almost like a lunar landscape, and then, suddenly, there's the hum of hives and fields full of blooming plants. The Arava Desert, which is part of the Negev, has unexpectedly turned out to be a perfect place for beekeeping. The air here is clean with almost no industrial pollution, which means the bees get sick far less often, fewer infections, fewer pests, and healthy colonies produce steady honey and help pollinate the crops. The local farmers literally rely on bees. They rent hives from beekeepers and place them right on their fields. As a result, harvests grow richer and fruits and vegetables become better in quality. And by the way, farms in the Arava now produce more than half of all agricultural products in Israel. If I were a bee, I'd definitely add that to my resume. So what am I getting at? The point is, even in a hot, dry environment, bees can not only survive, they can become key players in the economy. So theoretically, something similar could happen in Africa. So what other benefits can come from releasing bees? For example, a chance to save the entire global population of these insects. And they really do need saving. There's a parasite out there that kills hives from the inside. The problem's been around for a long time. All across the northern hemisphere, beekeepers are reporting massive losses of bee colonies. And this is no longer just sad statistics, it's a threat to food security. You know how the chain works. Fewer bees, less pollination, smaller harvests, less food. There are several reasons behind these mass bee deaths: diseases, parasites, habitat loss, poisoning. But among all the enemies of bees, there's one that stands out as especially dangerous. The Varroa mite, or Varroa destructor in Latin. Sounds like some supervillain from the 80s. But in reality, it's a tiny external parasite that latches onto a bee and drinks its body fluids, weakening it. Varroa mites are a real nightmare for beekeepers. It causes more damage than all other bee diseases combined. The parasite originally came from Asia, where it lived on the Asian honeybee, and as often happens, they eventually reached a balance. The mites reproduced mostly on the drone brood, that is on the males, while the other bees learned to find and clean them off. They even developed what's called hygienic behavior. They toss out infected larvae and groom each other to get rid of the mites. Everything was more or less fine. Until the 1950s, when the mite jumped onto the European honeybee, the one that makes most of the world's honey. And that's when the real trouble began, because European bees don't have those defense mechanisms. The mites breed right inside the cells with worker and drone larvae, eventually infecting the whole hive. And the thing is, these parasites don't just drink bee fluids, they also carry viruses. As a result, the colony weakens, loses its ability to defend itself, and almost always dies unless humans intervene. For instance, bees all over the world are now facing one of the most dangerous threats, the deformed wing virus. It's spread by the Varroa mite, and this combo has already wiped out millions of colonies in the US, Europe, and Asia. It all started back in the 1990s. Back then, scientists first recorded mass bee deaths. Every year, at least a third of all hives disappeared. And although at first the virus only affected honeybees, now it's been found in 18 different species. The biggest issue is that no one has managed to completely get rid of the Varroa mite, not a single country in the world. Once it enters a population, that's it. There's no turning back. For a long time, Australia was the only continent free of the Varroa mite, but a few years ago an outbreak happened there too. To stop it, they had to destroy more than 28,000 hives. That's about 40 million bees. I can't even imagine that number. Obviously, the damage was massive. In just one Australian state, New South Wales, the government spent over $130 million on a program to eliminate the mite. And even then, there's no guarantee of success. Varroa keeps coming back again and again. But what do African bees have to do with this? Simple. They're not afraid of the mite. Bees in other parts of the world are much more vulnerable, especially in the northern hemisphere, where humans have been breeding them for centuries for honey and for their gentle temperament. Meaning, we deliberately made bees convenient so they'd sting less. But in the process, we accidentally weakened their natural immunity. Yes, we got more honey, the bees got calmer, but the genetic diversity within the species dropped. And that's exactly what helps a species survive: disease, heat, and parasites. East African lowland honeybees live by completely different rules. They practically don't suffer from the Varroa mite and can easily survive without human help. Local beekeepers don't even consider the mite a threat. They rarely lose colonies because of it. These bees come with parasite protection built into their factory settings. And that's where it gets really interesting. If African bees are truly resistant, they could become a real salvation for bees all over the world. We could, for example, try breeding hybrids, a mix of African and European bees that would keep their resilience but be less aggressive. And if bees go completely extinct somewhere because of mites, pesticides, or climate change, African bees could serve as a backup. They could be relocated to areas where nature's already been destroyed to help restore it. Of course, that's a last resort, but theoretically it's possible. And if African bees managed to conquer the Sahara, their range would expand and their colonies would become more genetically diverse, which means there would be more places to draw from for future relocations. And that's not all. If the introduced bees manage to take root in a new place, they could become not just pollinators, but also part of the food chain. For example, food for the honey badger. Despite its name, the honey badger doesn't live on honey alone. Its menu is quite something. Insects, frogs, turtles, lizards, rodents, snakes, birds, eggs. Sometimes it even eats plants, berries, roots, bulbs. I talked about this recently. Still, the name honey badger exists for a reason. The thing is, this animal hunts not for honey, but for bee larvae that live inside the comb. For this delicacy, honey badgers are ready to endure hundreds of stings. They break into the hive, tear it apart with their paws, and lick out everything they can find. And yes, the bees attack, but come on, it's a honey badger. It just doesn't care. Their thick skin is almost impossible to pierce. If you look at the map, you'll see the honey badger lives across nearly all of Africa except for the north. And right there in the north stretches the Sahara, a massive barrier dividing the continent into two different climate zones. Because of the heat and lack of water, neither tropical animals nor Mediterranean species can cross it. Right now, the Sahara is uninhabitable for the honey badger, too dry, too barren, and not even much to fight with. But what if we added bees? If they changed the landscape, vegetation would appear and people might start settling there. Gradually, the area would become more hospitable, and then, maybe, just maybe, the honey badger could really expand its range. But don't think I'm proposing this just because I like honey badgers, although I'll admit that might be part of it. Yes, the Sahara is hot and merciless, but even now it's full of snakes. From harmless racers to venomous vipers whose bites cause swelling, bleeding, and tissue death. Not always fatal, but without a hospital, you're in trouble. These reptiles know how to survive even where there's not a drop of water, simply getting moisture from their prey. And now imagine this. If the desert starts to come alive with plants, farms, and water, new species of snakes will move in from nearby regions where it used to be too crowded for them. Makes sense, right? Right. And sooner or later, the farmers who dreamed of growing crops and living peacefully will find hundreds of hissing, venomous neighbors under their feet, as if the old ones weren't enough. And that's when it's honey badger time. Snakes make up almost a quarter of its diet. Every honey badger grows up with them, hunts them since childhood, and over the years builds resistance to venom. For most predators, a viper's bite is a death sentence. But for the honey badger, just dinner with a spicy aftertaste. So bees solve two problems at once. They don't just change the landscape, making it greener and more habitable, but they also attract a predator that can keep the number of venomous snakes in check. So we release bees into the Sahara. Can it change? Turn green? Become an oasis? Well, actually, no. You can't expect a single bee colony to just turn a barren desert into lush land. That's not how it works. For plants to even grow, they need water, seeds, and proper soil. Bees are pollinators, not gardeners. They help plants reproduce, but they don't create water out of thin air. Yes, in theory, if there were already some plants around, bees could speed up their spread, pollinate flowers, boost yields. But in practice, it all comes down to climate. There's little water in the desert, both above and below ground. Rainfall's almost non-existent, and underground sources are scarce. And if greenery suddenly increases, competition begins. Every new plant will pull moisture from the same meager supply. In the end, some seedlings just won't survive. So the bees' work won't give us the miracle we imagine. The desert won't turn into a green paradise just because they appear. And honestly, wiping out the desert isn't a good idea anyway. Strange as it may sound, it serves an important purpose. The Sahara is the main supplier of dust on the planet. And yes, that actually matters. Every year it releases between 400 and 700 million tons of dust into the atmosphere, which powerful winds then lift and scatter for thousands of miles. You think dust is a bad thing? Maybe, if you live in a city hit by Saharan winds. But in fact, dust carries iron and other trace elements that are vital for the oceans. Marine bacteria and phytoplankton use that iron to grow, and plankton is the foundation of all marine life. Without it, there would be no fish, no whales, no normal life in the ocean at all. So, Saharan dust drifts across the Atlantic, some of it settling over the ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. The rest gets carried even farther, to the Amazon, Scandinavia, Japan. Yes, Saharan dust actually reaches that far. And in the Amazon basin, it does some crucial work. It just so happens that the soil in the Amazon Valley is poor in phosphorus, an element plants can't grow without. And Saharan dust makes up for that shortage, delivering nutrients, a natural fertilizer of sorts. Without it, the rainforest wouldn't be as lush and alive as it is. Almost all the nutrients in this region are locked inside the plants. When leaves fall and start to rot, part of the nutrients go back into the soil, and the trees immediately absorb them. The cycle is closed, but not perfect. On top of that, it rains a lot here, and floods happen too, washing phosphorus out of the soil. The very phosphorus that's already in short supply. All of it drains into streams and rivers, carrying nutrients away like constantly pulling the plug in a giant bathtub. And that's where Saharan dust comes in. It brings around 22,000 tons of phosphorus a year, almost as much as the rains wash away. The desert is basically providing the Amazon with humanitarian aid from a distance. But even without the Amazon, dust is an important part of the Earth's entire system. It affects the climate, the oceans, the plants. Turns out the desert that seems like a symbol of lifelessness actually supports life, just not on their own turf. For the countries that have the Sahara within their borders, it's a disaster. But for the rest of the world, it's a key part of the balance. Remove the desert and everything would change. And it's far from certain those changes would be for the better. And yes, scientists haven't done any bee experiments in the Sahara. We were talking about a hypothetical scenario. But honestly, the idea isn't that crazy. Maybe it deserves a closer look after all. You owe me a like. See you later.